There is a town in Nevada that no longer exists. Not in the way most places disappear. The buildings remain, the streets remain, but the sound is gone. Rhyolite stands in the Bullfrog Hills, 25 miles from the nearest town. The wind moves through empty doorways. Dust settles on concrete steps that lead nowhere. Walls without roofs frame the desert sky. The silence here is complete. Not the silence of night, when the world rests. This is the silence of abandonment, of time stopped and never restarted. A 3-story bank building sits at the edge of what was once a street. Its walls are thick, its windows are hollow. Inside, the vault door hangs open. The steel is rusted but intact. The interior is empty. No money, no papers, no sign that anything was ever kept here worth protecting. The wind comes through the windows. It has come through these windows for more than a century. Across the street, a row of foundations marks where businesses stood. Concrete platforms, metal fragments, wood rotted down to splinters. The desert has reclaimed the spaces between. Sagebrush grows where floors once were. There are no people here. There have been no people here for a long time. A railroad grade runs along the edge of town. The rails are gone. The ties are gone. Only the raised earth remains. A scar across the landscape, showing where trains once came and went. The town sits in a valley. Mountains rise on all sides. The nearest road is dirt. Tourists come sometimes, in the middle of the day, when the heat is manageable. They walk among the ruins. They take photographs. They leave. By evening, the town is empty again. The silence returns. And there's a house here made entirely of bottles. Thousands of glass bottles, set in clay and mortar, forming walls that filter light into patterns of green and brown. It is the most intact structure in Rhyolite. Tourists visit this building more than any other. They marvel at the craftsmanship. They wonder who built it and why. The builder is gone. The purpose is forgotten. Only the bottles remain. The desert surrounds everything. It has always surrounded everything. Rhyolite was never separate from the desert. It was only a temporary interruption. A moment when humans tried to create something permanent in a place that permits nothing permanent. The attempt failed. The buildings remain as evidence of the attempt, not monuments, not memorials, simply remains. The wind moves through them. The sun rises and sets on them. They change slowly, imperceptibly, year by year. The walls crack further. The foundations settle deeper into the earth. One day, they will be gone entirely. But not yet. For now, Rhyolite exists in this state, not alive, not completely erased, suspended between existence and absence. The silence holds everything. Before there was Rhyolite, there was only desert. Miles of desert. Hundreds of miles. A landscape so vast and empty that distance became meaningless. 1 mile looked like 10. 10 looked like 50. The mountains in the distance never seemed to grow closer. Nevada, before the towns, was a place of extremes. Heat that could kill, cold that could kill, dryness that turned skin to leather and wood to dust. No water, or almost no water. Springs existed, hidden in canyons, known only to those who had crossed the desert before. But the springs were far apart. A man could die of thirst between them. The Shoshone people knew the desert. They had lived here for thousands of years. They understood its rhythms. They knew where to find water, when to travel, how to survive in a landscape that showed no mercy to those who misunderstood it. But the Shoshone did not build cities. They did not stay in one place. The desert would not permit it. For most of human history, this part of Nevada remained empty of permanent settlement. There was no reason to settle, no resources worth the cost, no land worth farming, no water worth fighting for. The desert was simply avoided. Then, in the middle of the 19th century, people began crossing it. Not to stay, to pass through. California lay on the other side. California, where gold had been discovered, where fortunes could be made, where land was green and water was plentiful. The desert was an obstacle, a test, a price to be paid for reaching something better. Wagon trains crossed the basin. They followed routes marked by those who had come before. They buried their dead along the way. They arrived in California with less than they had started with. Fewer people, fewer animals, fewer supplies. But they arrived, and California made them forget the desert for a time. Then someone found silver in Nevada, not near California, deep in the desert, in the mountains where no one had thought to look. The Comstock Lode, Virginia City, wealth beyond imagination, pulled from the earth in a place where nothing should have been, and people learned something. The desert was not empty, it was hiding things. All across Nevada, prospectors began searching, looking for the next discovery, the next Comstock. They spread out across the basin, into the ranges, into the valleys. They endured heat and thirst and isolation. Most found nothing. Some found enough to keep searching. A few found enough to start a town. The desert for a time became a landscape of possibility, not because it had changed, but because people began to see it differently. Rhyolite did not exist yet. The land where it would stand was empty. Sagebrush and rock, heat and silence. But the conditions for its existence were forming. Belief, desperation, hope, the materials from which boomtowns are built. Discovery of gold. In the summer of 1904, two men were searching for ore in the Bullfrog Hills. Their names were Ed Cross and Frank Shorty Harris. They were prospectors, not successful ones. But they had spent years moving through the Nevada desert, following rumors, testing rocks, finding nothing. They were accustomed to finding nothing. But in August of that year, they climbed a ridge in the Bullfrog Hills and noticed something. An outcrop of rock, exposed by erosion. The color was unusual, a greenish tint. They broke off a sample. They examined it. They did not know, immediately, what they had found. Identifying ore in the field is difficult. Visual inspection is unreliable, but the rock was heavy, heavier than it should have been. They took samples. They had them assayed. The samples contained gold, not traces, not amounts too small to extract profitably. Real gold, high-grade ore, the kind of discovery that changed everything. They filed claims. They named the district Bullfrog after the greenish color of the ore. What they spread the word. Word traveled fast, not through official channels, not through newspapers or telegrams, through prospectors, through miners, through men who spent their lives searching and who recognized immediately what this discovery meant. Within weeks, people began arriving, not dozens, hundreds. They came from mining camps across Nevada, from California, from as far away as Colorado. They came with tools and tents and hope. They came because they had spent years searching, and here, finally, was confirmation that the search mattered, that gold was still here, that fortunes could still be made. They came to the Bullfrog Hills and they began digging. The first arrivals camped wherever they could. No infrastructure existed, no buildings, no roads, no water supply, just the desert and the claims they filed. But claims alone were not enough. To extract gold, they needed equipment. To operate equipment, they needed money. To attract money, they needed proof. The proof was in the ore. Samples were sent to San Francisco, to investors, to mining companies. The assays came back favourable, better than favourable, exceptional. The ore was rich, richer than most discoveries, rich enough to justify the cost of building in the desert, rich enough to justify the risk. Investors began arriving, not prospectors now, men with capital, men who understood that gold in the ground was worthless. Gold extracted, refined, sold, that was wealth. They began forming companies, purchasing claims, raising funds. And they needed a town, not a camp, a real town, with buildings and streets and services, a place where workers could live, where equipment could be stored, where the business of mining could be conducted. The town would be called Rhyolite. It would sit in a valley near the richest claims, near water, or at least nearer to water than most places in the desert. The location was chosen not for beauty or comfort, but for practicality. Everything about Rhyolite would be practical, except for one thing, the belief that it would last. No one building Rhyolite in 1905 thought they were building something temporary. They thought they were building a city, a permanent settlement, a place that would outlive them. They believed this because they wanted to believe it, because belief was necessary, because no one builds in the desert unless they are certain the effort will be rewarded. The gold made them certain. The desert said nothing. The boom, a city appears. By 1906, Rhyolite had streets, not dirt paths, graded streets, laid out in a grid, named streets, Golden Street, Broadway, Bullfrog Avenue. The streets were wide, wider than they needed to be, wide enough for wagons to pass each other, wide enough to feel like a real city. Buildings rose along these streets, wood frame buildings at first, simple structures, one story, false fronts to make them look taller than they were, but functional. A general store, a saloon, a boarding house, then larger buildings, 2 stories, 3 stories, built from milled lumber hauled in by wagon from the nearest railroad, 60 miles away. The buildings had glass windows, imported glass, expensive glass, but necessary. A city needed windows. By 1907, Rhyolite had a bank, not a simple vault, a proper bank, 3 stories tall, built from concrete and stone. The walls were 2 feet thick, but the construction took months. The cost was enormous, but the bank was a statement, a declaration. It said that Rhyolite was not temporary, that money could be stored here, that the town had a future. The bank building dominated the street. It was the largest structure in town, taller than the saloons, taller than the hotels, visible from a distance. People pointed it out to newcomers. The bank, proof that Rhyolite was real. The town grew rapidly, not gradually, over decades, explosively, over months. In 1905, fewer than 1,000 people lived in Rhyolite. By 1907, the population exceeded 5,000. Some estimates placed it higher, 8,000, 10,000. The exact number was unknown. People arrived daily, some stayed, some moved on. The population was fluid, constantly changing, but the town felt full. The streets filled with activity, wagons hauling ore, workers walking to the mines, merchants opening shops, children running between buildings. Rhyolite had schools, 2 of them, one for younger children, one for older students. The schools had desks and chalkboards and teachers brought in from California. Parents sent their children to these schools. They wanted their children educated. They wanted them to have futures. They believed Rhyolite would provide those futures. The town had an opera house, a 2-story building with a stage and balcony seating. Travelling performers came through, theatre companies, musicians, speakers. The opera house was not always full, but it existed. That was what mattered. A city needed culture. A city needed entertainment. Rhyolite had newspapers, 3 of them. The Rhyolite Herald, the Bullfrog Miner, the Rhyolite Daily Bulletin. The newspapers printed daily. They reported on mining production, on local politics, on arrivals and departures, on crimes and marriages and deaths. They sold advertisements. Businesses paid to announce their services. Saloons, hotels, assayers, physicians. The advertisements suggest what life in Rhyolite was like, what people needed, what they wanted. They needed tools, dynamite, timber, nails. They wanted liquor, cigars, entertainment. The town had more than 50 saloons. Some were simple, a bar and bottles and nothing else. Others were elaborate, painted ceilings, imported mirrors, pianos. Men gathered in the saloons after work. They drank, they gambled. They talked about claims and ore grades and the price of gold. The saloons were loud, full of voices and laughter and arguments. They stayed open late, sometimes all night. Morning in Rhyolite began early. Before dawn, men left their homes and boarding houses and walked to the mines. The largest mines operated around the clock. Shifts changed every 8 hours. The mines had names: the Montgomery Shoshone, the National Bank, the Tramps Consolidated. These were not small operations. They employed hundreds of workers. They used industrial equipment, steam-powered hoists, ore crushers, stamp mills. The sound of the stamp mills was constant, a rhythmic pounding that echoed across the valley. The mills crushed ore day and night. The sound became part of the town's identity, proof of productivity, of wealth being extracted and processed. At noon, the streets filled again. Workers on lunch breaks, women shopping, children released from school. Rhyolite had restaurants, not many, like the food was simple: steak, potatoes, bread, coffee. But it was served on plates, at tables, in rooms with walls and roofs. That was luxury enough. Afternoons were hot, brutally hot in summer. People stayed indoors when they could. The work continued regardless. In the mines, underground, the temperature was more stable, still hot, but bearable. Evenings brought relief. The temperature dropped. The streets filled again. This was when Rhyolite felt most like a city, when the lamps were lit and the saloons opened their doors and music drifted into the street, when families walked together and merchants closed their shops and the day's work ended. The town had a rhythm, a routine, patterns that repeated daily. These patterns created the illusion of permanence. People built homes, not temporary shelters. Homes, wood frame houses with multiple rooms, porches, pitched roofs. They furnished these homes, brought in furniture, hung curtains, planted gardens, or tried to. The soil was poor and water scarce, but some plants survived. A woman might stand on her porch in the evening and look down the street and see lights in other homes and think, "This is my town. This is where I live." And she would be right. For a time. Rhyolite had a train station. 3 railroads served the town: the Las Vegas and Tonopah, the Tonopah and Tidewater, the Bullfrog Goldfield. The trains brought supplies, lumber, machinery, food. They brought people, investors, workers, families. They took out ore, tons of ore, shipped to mills elsewhere for final processing. The train station was busy, always busy. Arrivals and departures marked the passage of time. I was standing at the station, watching a train approach. Someone might believe that Rhyolite was connected to the larger world, that it was not isolated, that it was part of something bigger. And it was, for a time. The bank building cast a shadow across Golden Street in the afternoon. The shadow moved as the sun moved. People walked through it, stood in it to escape the heat. Inside the bank, transactions occurred. Deposits, withdrawals, loans. The vault held money, gold certificates, currency, documents. The bank manager sat at a desk and conducted business. He wore a suit. He spoke with authority. He made decisions about who received loans and who did not. The bank was supposed to last forever. All of it was supposed to last forever. The streets, the buildings, the schools and churches and homes, the people believed it would. The desert made no promises. Cracks in the foundation. The mines were expensive to operate. This was understood from the beginning. Mining always required capital, equipment, labour, time. But the ore in the Bullfrog Hills was rich enough to cover costs, rich enough to generate profit. At first, the richest ore was near the surface, the first veins discovered. These were mined quickly. The gold was extracted and sold. The profits were real. But as the surface ore was depleted, the mines had to go deeper. Deeper meant higher costs, more equipment, more labour, more time. Deeper meant more water. Underground water seeped into the shafts. It had to be pumped out constantly. The pumps required fuel, maintenance, constant attention. Deeper meant more danger, cave-ins, floods, accidents. The death rate in Rhyolite's mines was not exceptional by the standards of the time, but it was not negligible. Men died, regularly. The newspapers reported the deaths, usually briefly. A name, an age, a cause. The funerals were attended, then forgotten. The work continued, but the costs mounted. The mining companies had raised capital based on early assays, on the promise of high-grade ore. Investors expected returns. Returns depended on production, on extracting gold faster than costs accumulated. For a time this was possible. Then the ore grades began to decline. Not dramatically, not all at once. Gradually, veins that had produced high-grade ore began producing lower-grade ore. Veins that had seemed extensive began to play out. The geologists insisted that more ore existed, deeper, further down. The companies drilled exploratory shafts. They found ore, but not always high-grade ore, not always in quantities that justified the expense. The banks in San Francisco grew cautious. They had invested heavily in Rhyolite. They had expected profits. The profits were slower to materialize than anticipated. New loans became harder to secure. Interest rates increased. Terms became less favorable. Some companies consolidated, merged, pooled resources. This was presented as efficiency, as smart business. It was also desperation. The train station remained busy, but the nature of the traffic changed. Fewer people arriving, more people leaving. Not an exodus. Not yet. Just a shift. Subtle. Easy to miss unless you were paying attention. Some workers left when their contracts ended. They had come to Rhyolite for work, and when the work became uncertain, they moved on to other camps, other opportunities. The saloons were still full, but not as full. Some closed, not because they were unprofitable, but because the margins narrowed, because other opportunities seemed better. Golden Street in the morning looked the same as it always had. Buildings, sidewalks, people, but fewer people. The school enrollment declined, not sharply, just noticeably. Families with children were leaving, quietly, without announcement. The teachers remained. They taught smaller classes. They followed the same curriculum, but the classrooms felt different, emptier. The opera house still hosted performances, but less frequently. Travelling companies bypassed Rhyolite. The audiences were smaller, the revenue insufficient. The building remained, the stage remained, the seats remained. But the lights came on less often. The newspapers continued publishing. But the tone shifted. The early newspapers had been boosterist, optimistic, full of predictions about Rhyolite's glorious future. By 1908, the articles were more measured, more cautious. They reported facts without embellishment. Production numbers, ore shipments, company announcements. The editorials still expressed confidence. They insisted that Rhyolite had a future, that the current difficulties were temporary, that new discoveries would revive the town. But the insistence itself was telling. People who are certain do not need to insist. The bank building still dominated Golden Street. Its walls were as thick as ever, the vault door as heavy. But the activity inside decreased. Fewer transactions, fewer loans, fewer deposits. The bank manager still sat at his desk, still wore his suit, still conducted business. But the business was slower. Water remained a problem. Rhyolite had never had enough water. The town relied on wells and on water hauled in from springs miles away. The cost was high. The supply was unreliable. As the population grew, the demand exceeded the supply. Wells were drilled deeper. The water table dropped. Some wells went dry. New wells had to be drilled. Each new well was more expensive than the last. In summer, water was rationed. Not officially, but prices increased. People used less. The gardens failed. The few that had succeeded in the early years. Without sufficient water, they withered. The desert reclaimed the soil. The streets were still graded, still wide, still named, but dust accumulated. The town had workers to sweep the streets in the early years, to maintain them. By 1908, those workers were gone. The maintenance stopped. Wind blew dust across the streets. It settled in drifts against buildings. It coated windows. The illusion of permanence began to crack. Not collapse, not yet, but crack. People began to notice the things that were missing, the services that had stopped, the businesses that had closed. They noticed the quiet. Rhyolite had never been quiet. The stamp mills had run constantly. The saloons had been loud. The streets had been full of voices and wagon wheels and footsteps. Now, sometimes, in the middle of the day, the town was silent, just for moments, just long enough to be unsettling. Then the sounds would return. The mills would start again. Someone would shout. A wagon would pass. But the silence had been there, and once noticed, it could not be unnoticed. Tire collapse. In October 1907, a financial panic struck the United States. It began in New York. Banks failed. Stock prices plummeted. Credit disappeared. The panic spread west, to San Francisco, to Nevada. Mining operations depended on credit, on loans, on investors willing to risk capital. When the panic hit, the capital vanished. Projects were cancelled. Expansions halted. Companies that had planned to drill deeper, to buy new equipment, to hire more workers, those companies stopped. Some companies tried to continue. They operated on reduced budgets. They laid off workers. They slowed production. But reduced production meant reduced revenue. Reduced revenue meant they could not cover their costs. The mathematics were simple, brutal, but simple. In Rhyolite, the mines began to close. Not all at once, one by one, over months. First, the smaller operations, the marginal claims, the ones that had been barely profitable even in good times. Then the larger mines, the ones that had employed hundreds, the ones that had defined the town. The Montgomery Shoshone closed in 1909. The National Bank mine closed in 1910. When the mines closed, the workers left. They had no reason to stay, no work, no income. They packed what they could carry. They left what they could not: furniture, tools, belongings too heavy or too bulky to transport. They walked to the train station. They bought tickets to somewhere else, anywhere else. The trains that had once brought people to Rhyolite now carried them away. The population collapsed. 5,000 people in 1907, fewer than 1,000 by 1910, fewer than 200 by 1912. The businesses closed, the saloons, the hotels, or the restaurants, the shops. They did not close because they wanted to. They closed because they had no customers. A saloon with no customers is just an empty room with a bar. The owners left. They locked their doors. Some took their fixtures with them. The mirrors, the bottles, the furniture. Some left everything. It was not worth the cost of transportation. The schools closed. There were no children, or not enough children. The teachers left. Their salaries had been paid by the town. The town had no money. The school buildings stood empty, desks in rows, chalkboards on the walls, books on shelves, waiting for students who would never return. The opera house went dark. The last performance was in 1909. A small audience, sparse applause. Afterward, the performers packed their props and left. The building was locked. The stage remained. The seats remained. The curtain remained. But no light shone on them. The newspapers stopped publishing, one by one. The Rhyolite Herald. Last issue, 1909. The Bullfrog Miner. Last issue, 1910. The Rhyolite Daily Bulletin. Last issue, 1912. The final issues reported the town's decline, honestly, without embellishment. There was no point in pretending anymore. The streets emptied. Golden Street, which had been full of wagons and people and noise, became silent. The buildings remained, but the doors were closed. The windows were dark. Walking down Golden Street in 1911 was like walking through a theatre set. Everything looked real, but nothing was real. The bank building stood empty. The vault door was still locked, but there was nothing inside worth protecting. The manager had left. The tellers had left. The customers had left. And the building was just a shell. Concrete and stone, walls and windows. Nothing more. The trains still came, but less frequently. Once a week, then once a month. Then they stopped coming entirely. The railroads abandoned their lines. The tracks were pulled up. The ties were left to rot. The stations were closed. The railroad grades remained, scars across the landscape, evidence that trains had once run here. But the trains were gone. The houses were abandoned. Families left. They took what they could: clothing, photographs, small valuables. They left the rest: furniture, dishes, bedding. The doors were left unlocked. There was nothing to steal, and no one to steal it. The wind blew through the empty houses. It rattled the windows. It pushed open doors. Dust settled on floors, on tables, on beds where people had once slept. The gardens, the few that had survived, died, without care, without water. The desert reclaimed them. Sagebrush grew where flowers had been planted. By 1912, Rhyolite was a ghost town. Not officially. There were still residents, a few dozen, people who had nowhere else to go or who refused to leave. But functionally, the town was dead. The infrastructure failed. The water system, the electricity, the roads. There was no one to maintain them. No money to pay for maintenance. The systems simply stopped working. At night, Rhyolite was dark. Completely dark. No street lamps. No lights in windows. Just darkness. And silence. The stamp mills were silent. The machinery was still. Some of it was dismantled and sold for scrap. Some of it was left in place. too heavy to move, too expensive to salvage. It rusted. Slowly. The desert air is dry. Rust forms slowly in dry air. But it forms. The mines filled with water. The pumps had stopped. The underground springs that had always been a problem now flooded the shafts. The entrances were left open. Some were fenced. Most were not. It was dangerous to approach them. The timbers were rotting. The shafts were unstable. But there was no one to warn. No one to protect. Abandonment. The last residents of Rhyolite left quietly. There was no final ceremony, no official announcement, no moment when someone declared the town finished. People simply left, one by one, year by year. By 1916, fewer than 20 people remained. They lived in scattered houses, the most intact structures, the ones with roofs that did not leak, with walls that kept out the wind. They survived on little, gardens where water could be found, salvage from abandoned buildings. Occasional work in the few mines that still operated sporadically. They were not a community, not really, just individuals who happened to occupy the same space. They rarely saw each other. Days would pass without human contact. The silence was total. One of the last residents was a man who lived in the bottle house. The house made of glass bottles. He had not built it. He had moved in after the builder left. The house was cool in summer. The thick walls insulated against heat. It was cold in winter, but bearable. He lived there alone. He had no family in Rhyolite, perhaps no family anywhere. He walked through the town sometimes, down Golden Street, past the bank building, past the empty saloons and hotels. He was the only person who walked those streets. And there was something eerie about being the only living presence in a place built for thousands. About walking past buildings designed to be full and finding them empty. About hearing his own footsteps echo. He did not stay long. In 1918, he left. He locked the door of the bottle house behind him. He walked to the road. He found a ride to the nearest town. He never returned. After 1918, Rhyolite was completely abandoned. No residents, no workers, no caretakers, just buildings and desert. The buildings began to deteriorate rapidly. Without maintenance, structures fail quickly in the desert. The sun is relentless. It cracks wood. It fades paint. It weakens joints. The wind is constant. It loosens boards. It tears at roofs. It finds every gap and widens it. Rain is rare, but when it comes, it is destructive. And the roofs were not designed to handle prolonged moisture. They leaked. Water-damaged ceilings, rotted floors. Winter brought freezing temperatures. Water in cracks froze and expanded. The expansion broke stone, split wood. Year by year, the buildings fell apart. Roofs collapsed. Walls sagged. Foundations settled unevenly. The wood frame buildings went first. They were the least substantial. Within a decade, most were gone, reduced to piles of weathered boards. The brick and stone buildings lasted longer. The bank, the train station, the school. But they deteriorated too. Slower, but inevitably. Windows broke. Wind. Vandalism. Time. The glass shattered and fell. The frames rotted. The openings became empty rectangles. Doors fell from hinges. They lay on the ground. Or they blew away. Interior walls collapsed. Ceilings fell in. The floors gave way. The buildings became shells. Walls without interiors. Facades without backs. But they remained, partially, enough to show what they had been. The streets remained. The grid was still visible. The names were forgotten, but the layout persisted. Sagebrush grew in the streets, not densely. The grading had compacted the soil, but plants found purchase. The desert reclaimed the town, not aggressively, slowly, patiently. The desert had time. Occasionally people visited, not residents, travelers, curiosity seekers. They walked through the ruins. They marveled at what remained. They wondered what had happened here. Some took souvenirs, bottles, nails, pieces of wood. Some left their names, carved into walls, scratched into beams. They came, they looked, they left. The town remained. In 1937, the bottle house was photographed. The photograph appeared in a magazine. It drew attention. People began visiting specifically to see the bottle house. It was unusual, unique, worth seeing. The other buildings were ruins, but the bottle house was intact. The bottles were still in place. The walls still stood. It became a landmark, not of Rhyolite's boom, but of its abandonment. The town became known not for what it had been, but for what it had become. A ghost town, a ruin, a place where time had stopped. Rhyolite today. Rhyolite exists today as a ruin. The bank building still stands. 3 stories of concrete and stone. The walls are intact. The windows are empty. The vault door hangs open. Tourists visit. They park on the dirt road. They walk through the ruins. They photograph the bank. It is the most photographed building in Rhyolite. From a distance, it looks almost whole. The walls are solid. The structure is sound. Up close, the decay is visible. Cracks in the concrete, missing stones, graffiti on interior walls. But it stands. It has stood for more than a century. The train station is a ruin. Walls remain. No roof. The interior is exposed to the sky. Foundations mark where other buildings stood. The school, the opera house, the saloons, concrete platforms, metal fragments, scattered bricks. The bottle house is maintained, not by the town. There is no town. By the Bureau of Land Management. The bottles are still in place, thousands of them. Green and brown glass, filtering desert light. Tourists walk around it. They peer through windows. They take photographs. It is fragile. The mortar is crumbling. The structure is unstable, but it remains. The streets are still visible. The grid is still clear. Golden Street, Broadway. Sagebrush grows between the ruins. The desert has reclaimed most of the town, but the layout persists. The bones of the city. The railroad grades are still there. Raised earth running through the valley. The rails are long gone. The ties are long gone. But the scars remain. Visitors come every day. Not many. A few dozen, a few hundred on busy days. They drive from Las Vegas or from Death Valley. Rhyolite is on the way. A detour, worth an hour. They arrive in the afternoon. They walk among the ruins. They read the signs, historical markers, explaining what stood where, what happened when. The signs are informative, but they cannot convey the scale, the ambition, the belief. The visitors see ruins. They do not see the town. They take photographs. They post them online. They move on. By evening, the ruins are empty again. The sun sets behind the mountains. The shadows lengthen. The temperature drops. The wind picks up. It moves through the empty windows. It rattles loose boards. It stirs dust. The silence returns. At night, Rhyolite is dark. No lights. No people. No sound except wind. The stars are visible. Thousands of them. The desert sky is clear, unpolluted. The bank building is a silhouette against the stars. A dark shape, rectangular, solid. It looks permanent, like it will stand forever. But nothing stands forever. The walls are cracking, slowly, imperceptibly, year by year. The foundations are settling. The structure is shifting. One day the bank building will fall. A wall will collapse, or the whole structure will come down. It could be next year. It could be in a century. But it will fall. All ruins fall eventually. For now, Rhyolite stands. partially, enough to be visited, enough to be remembered. It is preserved not by effort, but by isolation. The desert protects what it has reclaimed, not intentionally, but effectively. There is no reason to demolish the ruins, no need for the land, no profit in the materials. So they remain, a monument to impermanence, to ambition, to failure, to the belief that gold could overcome geography, that desire could overcome environment. The belief was wrong, but the buildings remain as evidence that the belief existed, that thousands of people came to this place, that they built a city, that they believed it would last, that they were mistaken. Ending reflection. There is something humbling about ruins. They are evidence of effort, of labor, of hope, and evidence that effort is not enough. But the people who built Rhyolite were not foolish. They were not naive. They understood hardship. They understood risk. They came anyway. They built anyway. They believed that gold justified everything, the cost, the isolation, the harshness. For a time, it seemed they were right. The town grew. The mines produced. Wealth was extracted. But wealth is not permanence. The gold ran out, or became too expensive to extract. The difference is academic. When the gold stopped flowing, the town stopped existing. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. The desert, which had been interrupted, resumed. Sagebrush grew where streets had been. Wind blew through rooms where families had lived. The silence returned. It had always been there, waiting. Rhyolite did not disappear. It transformed. From a city to a ruin, me from a living place to a memory. The transformation was not unique. Boom towns across the West followed the same trajectory, built quickly, abandoned quickly, but each one believed it would be different, that it would last. Rhyolite believed. The bank building was designed to last for generations. Its walls were 2 feet thick. The schools were built for children who would grow up here, who would have children of their own. The houses were homes, not temporary shelters. Homes. The people who built them intended to stay. They did not. Not because they changed their minds, because the circumstances changed. Because belief, no matter how strong, cannot change geology, cannot create ore where none exists, cannot make the desert fertile. Belief can build cities, but it cannot sustain them. That requires resources, water, ore, money. Rhyolite had ore, for a time. When the ore was gone, the city had no reason to exist. It collapsed, not in fire, not in violence, in silence. People left, buildings emptied. The desert reclaimed what had been taken from it. And now, Rhyolite stands as a reminder, not a warning. Reminders are not warnings, just a statement, a fact. This happened. A city was built here. It grew. It thrived, briefly. Then it ended. The ruins do not judge. They do not mourn. They simply exist. For now. One day they will be gone. Completely. The bank will collapse. The bottle house will crumble. The foundations will sink into the earth. The desert will erase the last traces. And Rhyolite will be truly gone. Not a ruin. A memory. Eventually, not even a memory. Just desert. As it was before. As it will be after. The wind moves through the empty streets. The sun rises. The sun sets. The silence continues.